I'm with Dr. Rob McKenna, founder of WiLD Leaders, one of my favorite groups to follow along with. And I'm going to be reading from notes today because we have a lot to go over, Rob. But thanks for being with us.
It's awesome, Andrew. This is a blast.
It will be.
I hope so.
All right, let's dive right in. I wrote down questions because we're covering a lot of topics today. So what is WiLD, whole and intentional leader development, and why is it such a game changer in terms of the developing leader capacity inside of an organization?
Man, oh man. Ask a bigger question.
I can. There's a second part.
That's the second part. WiLD Leaders, as you said, the acronym stands for whole and intentional leader development. And so there's kind of a double meaning in the title, because I think at the same time, what we do is provide a system for developing leader capacity in every kind of industry you could imagine, which is, I can say that now. It's amazing when you've been in business long enough and you're like, it's hard to imagine an industry we haven't touched. But the fundamentals of that is, like, many organizations have not imagined having a system for developing leaders. And we always say that, you have a system for almost everything in your life or your business, that when something works, it has a system behind it. So how is it that we don't have a system for developing deep-seated leader capacity in our organizations? And so that's what it is we actually do. What the acronym also does represents as well, the word WiLD is, like, we believe that every leader has their own wild story, their own kind of story that doesn't, I always say, like, it's told over a cup of coffee or a beer, but it doesn't always let out in an intentional kind of way that's affecting the way that they're actually functioning inside their organization. And so we all have them. I mean, you talk to any leaders, and my deep conviction is that we all have those stories. And so if we could translate that story into levels of effectiveness, what would that look like? It's kind of what this is about.
And you did a TED Talk on this called Hold Leaders in a Broken World.
Yeah.
What was the lead up to the TED Talk?
Oh, man. So part of the word whole is that I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. And so that means that my training and background is in the science behind all the things related to behavior in the workplace. And there's decades of work on how leaders learn and grow on the job. And so there's this whole story that so often in the leadership spaces gets taken down into sort of small bite-sized pieces that are important, but they don't really capture what it means to develop a whole person. So when I look at you as a leader, I see Andrew and I think, I know that it's like, I almost picture you this way, like you've got these variables that I've studied psychologically that are going on in who you are, that include everything from your competence to the call on your life and your work, to whether or not you have social support, to the experiences that you've had that have developed the competencies that you experience, to what motivates you, that's just a few of the pieces of that puzzle that makes up Andrew. And so there's these common pieces that we know from literally decades of research on what it means to invest in and develop Andrew as a leader, like every other person. There are these common variables, but the way those things work themselves out in your life is different than someone else if they were sitting here. And so having a system that both touches on these major areas we know we need to work, but also allows you to see the nuances of what that's about. And so that wholeness piece is to take all those variables and create an intentional structure for someone to develop, not just like to do a seminar or a one-off, but to actually develop a process that could live with them inside their organization in that context to help them learn and grow. And the reason why I was called Whole Leaders in a Broken World is that the reality is that we function in this world where we aspire to wholeness. I think that's the common story in so many people. But yet there is that whole story is that there's both fragmentation that's happening at the same time as our aspiration to something better. And so that's why I titled it that way, to sort of get real about what's going on in every leader that we ever interact with. Every person, by the way.
Yeah. So. And you just finished your next book, right? So
yeah.
Book is finished, not published yet.
Yes.
Published in a few months.
Yeah.
But you've called it your manifesto. So what about this piece is...
Oh, man.
I don't even need to finish the question.
Yeah. It's it was funny when I first threw that word out a few years ago when I was even starting to write this book and some of the work that we do. The word manifesto in some people's minds was like too big. Mm-hmm. And I had a leader recently who has become a dear friend, and he said, Yeah, it's a manifesto. This is your call to arms. And it was kind of that this idea of what it means to develop whole leaders is, it really is a call to arms, in that it's a call to fight for something that we know is going on in each of us, but so often we have not had a way to be intentional about that learning and growth. And what I talk about, this is kind of the purpose behind the book, is that I'm giving the big story, is that every major movement of change in our world, we always talk about the needs. And so, for example, let's go into the nonprofit space, like the need for clean water. These are critical things. The need to fight human trafficking, the need to build my business so that I can sustain the life of so many people who are employees. Whatever it is, every major movement of change, oftentimes we think about the need and funding the need, but every one of those things begins with a leader. And so what's deep on my heart is this necessity. You get into the story of any person, and I say these are the stories that they whisper out loud, but scream out inside of them. You know, I'm trying to do something impossible, and it seems like it's important. And so the emphasis on this is, that's the big story. And it's not whether you're leading a global nonprofit on this huge mission, or you're leading a local business, or even trying to lead in your family. Yeah. Is that I think it's time to sort of get real with that, and also to say let's move based on what we know is true, not only from our experience but research as well, as opposed to just kind of making the same mistakes again. And so I feel like in this book is kind of like, it lays it out there in that way. Yeah.
Well, this is a non-traditional approach to leadership development. You've defined a new category with this whole and intentional leader development, training capacity for leadership. So yeah, what's the secret sauce that WiLD clients get? I
would say this, that the common theme in a lot of leader development efforts, so if you think about what is kind of when people think about leadership development, unfortunately, the only thing that often comes to mind is these one-off, I went to a seminar, I heard a motivational speaker, I had my team do a book club together, so we read a book. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those kinds of things, but the reality is that you could be systematic in your intentional investment in seeing the people inside of your organization. And that system and process has not existed in so many contexts. And I'm not saying we're the first people to do this, because there are many large corporations that leveraged the wealth and depth of information that was out there on how to develop leader capacity on the job that have been doing this for quite a while. But in a lot of the organizations we work with, they just never imagined that they could have a system in place. And Andrew, what's so crazy that even I don't know if I would have believed, I always said that, like, you can do this. I would tell CEOs that we would work with. We work with more trades businesses than you can possibly imagine. Mm-hmm. Where people would assume, like, I don't know if someone in the plumbing industry, if a plumber who's transitioning into management could do this. And the businesses we work with now know, they could do this. And that transition to management will be just as hard as it will be for a software developer in a tech firm in our region. Mm-hmm. And that's what's been amazing, is to put a system in place for not just a one-off, but that lives inside of the cadence and the rhythms of the actual business. And the reason why that's so critical is because what the research is clear about is that leader capacity, so much of it is developed through crucible, high-pressure experiences that are happening on the job. Mm-hmm. So in order to do leader development at the deepest, best level, it means that whatever we're providing should be alongside the rhythms of that pressure that a person's feeling.
What is the ROI for organizations that have worked with you over the years? And I'm going to add into that, is there ever any pushback about training people?
What do you mean by the second part? I want to know what you mean by that.
So do you ever run up against leaders who have a fear that if they provide leadership training, they will take something away from their position as leaders?
Oh, that's interesting. So threaten their position in that? That's fascinating. Let me go to the first part with return on investment, because I think that's an interesting start. And we just did a few sessions on this. And I will tell you that the presenting needs that many organizations, especially in the small to mid-cap business space, because a lot of larger corporations have tried to build systems like this as well. But a lot of those businesses, their presenting need is, I've realized I do not have the leader capacity in my organization that I thought I did. And many of those folks in these small to mid-sized businesses are also maybe looking at handing off their businesses to someone else. So they're thinking, have I done this? And they realize it's almost not too late, but it's when they realize I should have started this years ago.
Yeah.
This intentional investment. And because in many ways, succession planning may be a presenting need as an example, but succession planning is really, all that is leadership development under the fire of urgency. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's the same thing. And so they wish they had started earlier. And so when you ask about the return on investment is, when we've done impact studies where we see these psychological shifts in the people who have worked with us. And so things like people being able to communicate more effectively, being more open, being more agile. We have like conservative estimates on this transition that people experience when they actually use what's called the WiLD toolkit, our process for doing this. I think what's kind of interesting is that in many cases, those CEOs who come in with a presenting problem, the return on investment is something that shifts for them. We actually had a CEO recently who said, Rob, I asked him, because some of these CEOs become really good friends. I mean, you know how this goes. Yeah. And I said, why did you first call WiLD Leaders? And he said, because I needed to make sure I was developing successors and I wanted to retire. And he said, but it's changed. And he said, now, I never heard a CEO say this before. He said, now I know that what I want to do is build a spirit of shalom across every person in my business.
Explain for anybody who might not understand what shalom is.
A spirit of peace, of presence, of progress and rest. It was just this spirit of a deeply abiding, this is what he went on to describe, of deeply abiding peace and a settling in who I am. Not just like be yourself kind of who I am, but a settling into who I am so that I could be who I am, but also serve people across my organization. And he wanted that spirit for everybody there. And it's just been incredible, especially over the last few years, to watch the impact of putting a system in place for multiple years. Because that's the other thing that we do is different. This isn't a one-off even over 1 year, because people's developmental narrative changes year after year. And so that's what's been cool to watch too.
So you just told a positive story about a CEO engagement. What is the greatest challenge that CEOs face engaging with you?
Man, that is one of the greatest challenges is a common thing that we will say to an organization, and I just don't care how far up the chain we're going. A few years ago, I was working with an organization that everybody knows that is in the healthcare space, and they were wanting to develop a succession planning system. They wanted a succession system in their organization. It was to be thousands of leaders. And they had up on the wall this listing of all the leader development resources that they had spent money on, and it represented millions and millions of dollars. Like, these are all the leader development initiatives inside this organization. And I was talking to their VP of talent and about this list, and kind of fascinated by all this stuff. And the CEO walked in, and I said, do you personally use any of this stuff? And he said, Rob, to be honest, I don't. And I said, this is the leader in the business, right?
Yeah.
And I said, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful or anything, but I said, so when you look at that wall, it represents millions of dollars of expense on leader development, succession stuff. And I said, what is it to you? What is all that to you? And he said, it's noise. And I'm telling you, Andrew, I wanted, in that moment, I wanted to be out of the business of noise. And one of the things that is probably the most challenging thing for a CEO who works with us is what we'll say most of the time, whoever the most senior leader in the organization that we're working with, whoever that person is, if that person is not actually using the process and system for themselves, we've come to the point where we'll tell them we can't work with you. And it's not just because it models development for the rest of the people in the organization, but also because realistically, if we're going to have an impact, a lot of our work is going to be with that most senior leader.
Yeah.
And so it's twofold, right? They're modeling something, and there's nothing more powerful. If Andrew's the CEO and they see Andrew invest in his own development, and he uses the skills and knowledge inventory, which is one of the tools in the toolkit, and he says, let me tell you what I'm learning about myself in this process that's continuing to change. Nothing is more powerful. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that leaders face in their paradigm shift in working with WiLD leaders is you've got to use the process. Like, you're one of the key leaders here. And so if it really is important, it's important enough for you to do. You know what I mean?
Well, and I know that your team uses the toolkit.
Yeah.
You go through it every year and track your improvements.
Yep.
So you're really practicing what you're preaching.
Yeah. Yeah. We did that last Monday.
And then let's roll from that into impact.
Okay.
Right? So I know you track. We talked a little bit about metrics. You're tracking these things over the course of an engagement with a client. What is the impact on performance?
Here's what is like, this is so fascinating to me. And I think I would have said this less boldly a few years back.
Okay.
But is that so imagine you're a team of people and you're beginning to use this, and quite literally all we do is curate and architect a 60 to 90 minute conversation once a month for a team within an organization or all teams across the organization. And what is so amazing is that, and it's just based on basic psychological principles related to leader development. And then what we do is that everybody on the team has this reflective moment using one of the tools, and then they come together to share those results. And so it's like it's this affecting the psychology of the individual, because one of my core convictions is the way you actually develop an organization and you change it, if you want to even change culture, is it starts with the one. And so what the power of that is when you and I, if we're on a team together, when you and I become more aware of our competencies, for example, and also what we would describe as the calling and purpose behind our life, that directional moment. We become aware of where the organization is going and how we fit into that, as opposed to the organization just telling us, as we actually are contributing to that conversation. And when we come together and share that together, what happens within a team is then something begins to catalyze that we've never seen before. It's like this basic psychology of a person, and inviting them into a conversation, and then inviting them to share something that they've never shared before. And doesn't mean we get every skeleton out of the closet, but it means we just begin to provide a safe environment to begin processing together our own development related to our performance. What we've seen is that's where the performance shifts start to happen. That's where the performance shifts start to happen, is in that conversation of sharing, because now the team is aware, okay, here's the competencies we have, here's where each person is going, why, this is what's motivating each of us, where are the selection gaps where we might need to find people who bring in certain gifts and skills into the job, what are the developmental stretch areas for me, or these gaps in my own learning and growth. Mm-hmm. And what's been crazy is to watch that impact on how a team performs together, their level of agility, their ability to deal with change, have hard conversations on their hiring practices, and their selection processes, even the way they have tough conversations around whether people are performing or not.
You mentioned noise, right? Your conversation with the CEO. There's a lot of leadership material out there to be consumed. What's, in your opinion, what is being hit on that is right in those conversations, and what's missing from those conversations?
Oh, it is so interesting. In fact, sometimes I'm not a great consumer of other people's stuff, but I recently got motivated to say, like, what you see certain kinds of things, and some of these folks are my friends, and some of them I don't know, but I went off and I went on this kind of tour. Let me see what's going on out there. What is the common story? And Andrew, it kind of blew my mind, because there is something fundamental in the water that is true, to your point. And that fundamental truth, people will call it different things. You pick your leadership expert. And when I started to look at it, it was usually a 2x2. So it's two things that are almost always important, but tend to be emphasized. One or the other tends to be emphasized. And as I was watching all these experts, and even thinking about the things that I share and I'm convicted about, it doesn't take long, if you've studied leadership theory, to realize that these are things that are 100 years old in the modern age of leadership theory. So these are as long, they go back as far as human beings do, I'm sure. But the fundamental two things are this, the necessity for an emphasis on people and an emphasis on tasks. It goes back to the Ohio State studies that were done in the 40s. The University of Michigan followed up with that. You go back to situational leadership, Hersey and Blanchard, some people who are old enough will remember those folks. You go to, I could name theorist and expert after expert, all the way through Peter Drucker. If you go back, and by the way, if people have not read Drucker, because I'm amazed at how many younger people have not actually, I've been revisiting all of his stuff. It's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. That fundamental thing that we face, no matter what we call it, because there are different names these days, comes back to this emphasis on how do I structure my organization? How do I structure the work? Because we know that's important. Mm-hmm. And how do I see people? And how do I show consideration and kindness? How do I express hope? How do I deal with the human capacity alongside the structural capacity? That is the thing. And the way that people approach that might be a little bit different. But what I found it affirming, because it means that we are onto something. What I find that people sometimes get wrong is an overemphasis on one or the other. Mm. And I think the challenge there working with organizations is just to help them realize, like, figure out your default, which one that you're kind of emphasizing over the other, and say it's always going to be true that you're going to have to invest in your people, see them more effectively, develop leader capacity at the same time. Structure matters. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Structure and systems matter. So
is it a balance or a tension?
Oh man, I see it as a paradox. But you know me a little bit, so this is a theme of my life. But I think it depends on the person where you see it. But I think fundamentally, what I hope people don't dismiss is that the tension you feel, that paradox, and a paradox being two seemingly contradictory things, both of which are true. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't reduce the contradiction. So in other words, there always will be a tension. I kind of like that word as well. But these are paradoxical truths, and they pull leaders in different directions. And I think to figure out which part are you doing well, and how do we scale up into doing both sides better.
We got to talk about your book, Composed.
Okay.
So your previous book, Composed, it impacted a lot of people. So my question is, who do you hope reads it in the future? I mean, now that you've done the TED Talk, who are you hoping will pick up a copy of Composed and take that to heart?
Yeah, I always said I hope parents and presidents read it, because I think it's anyone who finds themselves in a high pressure moment where they're saying, I need to understand what's going on inside of myself, whether someone's speaking in front of an audience for the first time or heading into a situation in their organization that they've never faced before, or having a conversation with their 13-year-old son or daughter. Like, I'm just, anyone that's facing that moment, I hope would pick up this book, because it is a deep dive into our research around what it is that allowed people to show up well in those high pressure moments. But it describes what that's like and what is the fundamental tension that people are facing. But then also provide strategies and solutions for what did we find? Because what we did was we found that the common tension that every leader, and when I say leader, I mean it could be a parent or a president, so someone who's responsible for the work and development of someone else who's going first. The fundamental thing that they shared in these high pressure moments was this tension between staying true to themselves, their own convictions, what they thought should happen, and at the same time staying connected to other people. Mm-hmm. And that's why I care deeply about this. Like, even people who are in close relationships, I imagine that helping people who are in marriages to understand, like, yeah, that's my experience. And someone who doesn't see the tension in that probably has some work to do. Do you know what I mean? Like, There's a little bit of, that's what's going on. Like, there is this, it's not just about what you want, or it's not just about what they want, is how do you navigate that moment? And so that's what that book was about, is what we discovered in the research and some of the strategies that could help people.
Well, and that brings me to the closing question. What is the secret to leading well under pressure?
Okay. So what we discovered was 11 strategies that leaders were using in these high pressure moments.
I asked for one.
I know, I'm about to get there, but I have to frame it up that way. And so I think what I would hope people would do is pay attention to the 11. But I did want to understand if I could look at the data and say, if I had to pick one or two, what would they be? And I would only pick two if the research showed that two were there. And so what we found was that for most people, if I could add one strategy, one or two on top of everything else, the number one predictor of a person's capacity to self-regulate, to be composed, to be their best, most present self in those moments was sense of purpose. It was the extent to which that person knew specifically why they are in that particular situation. And that's fascinating to me because I'm studying myself. You know what I mean? I'm looking for strategies. And it means that if I want to be my best self in a conversation with my 21-year-old son, and it's a tough conversation, one of the best things that I could do is not just have the conversation, but to think about beforehand, why am I his dad in this season of his life? Mm-hmm. And what we found is when leaders did that work, it had this unbelievable impact on their capacity to show up well. Mm-hmm. And then the second strategy that actually was contributing even above what sense of purpose was, not more, but on top of, was focusing on potential. So it was the extent to which a leader on top of purpose could say, what are the positive potential outcomes in this situation, even if everyone else may only see barriers? So if I move through this well, what could emerge that has potential in it? And there's a lot of hope in that too, we know. But imagine those two things were most powerful for people to remain composed, and it worked especially well. I'm just giving you more researchy stuff. Yeah. For people who took things personally, which was, by the way, most of our sample.
Interesting.
So I'm a weird combination of CEO scientists, like really mad scientists. And so most of our sample, so it means that most people take things personally, and those sense of purpose and focusing on potential were really powerful.
Purpose and potential. Yeah. Things to remember. Got it. All right, Rob, where can people find you? How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, all of our stuff is at wildleaders.org. And if anybody wants, if we can't help you, we'll find somebody that can in the whole area. If you're looking to develop leader capacity of yourself, or you want to develop something that's scalable across your organization, just send an email to contact@wildleaders.org. Just say that and say, we always say, just say go wild, and then we'll get back and talk to you about what it would mean to put a system for developing people across your organization in place.
Love that. Well, thanks for hanging out, answering a bunch of questions today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again real soon.
Thanks, Andrew.